Today on the Mr. Maple podcast, Tim and Matt count down the top 20 white maples for your garden.
Konnichiwa, y'all, and welcome to the Mr. Maple Show. I'm Matt. I got my brother Tim with you, and as always, we're ready to discuss some Japanese maples.
Hey, y'all. I'm excited about today. Today, we've got a great one for you. Today, we're going to be talking about white Japanese maples, and we're actually going to list out some of our favorites. We're going to go down from number 20 all the way down to number 1. If you're following this on your favorite podcast platform, make sure to give us a 5-star rating. We'd really appreciate it. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, we do air a video component to these that shows some photos of these plants as well. Make sure you get involved in the live chat, and make sure you like and subscribe.
Yeah, now, white's one of the most interesting colors in the plant world. It's a very unique color. It's not commonly seen, so it's very outside the box. We've talked about pink plants. We've talked about green plants before on podcasts. We want to talk about some of the most distinctly white Japanese maples and how that makes them unique, how that makes them really stand out amongst all the other color patterns.
I mean, I love white. White is a great way to put into your dark spots in your garden and brighten up those spots. That white is such a unique color that you don't get on many plants. You may get it on some flowering plants, but rarely do you get foliage that gives you that white color.
Yeah, I do a white dance, but apparently all my dances are white people dances, so I can't dance. Anyway, let's get into our whitest Japanese maples. I think it'll be an interesting one. Some of these just exude bright white color, and they almost look, albinistic. Like some of these almost look like they have not enough green in them, that they need the chlorophyll help. But all the trees we're going to be talking about today actually stand alone on their own. They're unique Japanese maples that don't have to have a symbiotic relationship like Pinky. Like, we'll throw Pinky out there as an honorable mention. I know we've talked about that one before to you. I've also seen trees in Japan that were so interesting where they literally grew the rootstock behind the fence and hid that from you. And that actually fed the chlorophyll for this all white plant that's going on. We don't have that going on with these. These are all distinctly able to create chlorophyll on their own. So it's kind of an interesting category. If it's truly an albino plant, it might even have to have that green symbiotic relationship with a rootstock.
Yeah, and it's interesting about these variegated plants. You often wonder what causes this variegation, what causes it to be so white. Years ago, people used to always think that variegation was actually a virus because in some hostas, they have proven that it was a viral infection that caused this white variegation.
And those people made it really hard to get cool stuff into the country.
They did. And a lot of the laws on Japanese maples, bringing variegated Japanese maples over to the United States, are based on the fact that they think that it could be viral. And it's actually been proven that most of the variegation on Japanese maples is actually an absence of the chlorophyll, which then fills in with the white. Some of the plants like Pinky you mentioned, that's one of our honorable mentions. It's a very pink plant when it leaves out.
Right.
After the pink color, the pink color turns to a white, which is pretty awesome. It is a slow-growing one, but that is one that requires a symbiotic relationship. You have to have something to nurse the plant along to provide it chlorophyll so that it can grow. A lot of plants that have so much white variegation on them often are much slower growing than other trees. And it's interesting because some of these are faster grower plants that we'll be talking about today, but they still have tons of white variegation. And so we put a good list together of our top 20 Japanese maples and maples. Vanity, for instance, isn't a Japanese maple. It's one of our other honorable mentions. It's an Acer rubrum. And it leaves out with a little bit of pink variegation and then goes to white. I think there's Candy Ice, there's Snowfire, there's some other Acer rubrums out there. But again, this is a larger growing tree. It can revert, so it does put on some reversion where it will go solid green foliage. But it is another type of maple that has some really good white variegation to it.
If you want to see a massive specimen of this, go to our YouTube channel and watch our walkthrough of Seabright Gardens. There's a beautiful vanity in that one. Shows you a really good example of like that one's full potential. It's like close to a 20-foot tree already. and you can really see what one of those looks like at a nice mature size. Variegation's so interesting. It really is one of the more defining characteristics, I think, for Japanese maples. It's probably why a lot of people do get into Japanese maples, and I wish that it was more viral. That way we could infect more plants with our Japanese maple variegation. Could you imagine if we could infect plants and be like, well, I think I would like a weeping variegated Ryusin. Boom, done. That sounds great. So whenever we identify what part of it that other plants can catch, I'm all about that.
Now, coming in another honorable mention is Acer pictum, Akikaze Yataka. This was a chance seedling that was found by Yataka Tanaka Tsukasa Maple from Akikaze Nishiki. Now, Akikaze Nishiki is one of these Acer pictums from Japan that's often mislabeled as an Acer truncatum because it is a pictum dissecum or dissectum, which is a little more divided on the foliage than your typical batwing maple. But Akikaze Nishiki is basically the more variegated form of Akikaze Yataka is the more variegated form of Akikaze Nishiki. A chance seedling from Japan. We've got this in the works here at Mr. Maple. It is a pretty cool tree, but it is a green leaf with white speckles all across it.
Yeah, we've already talked about it in a podcast, but I could easily throw in the honorable mentions Inka Nishiki as well. It's another variegated pictum from Japan with incredible. It starts out pink and then goes to a white. Another one of our honorable mentions here we threw in is Shin Hikasa. And we picked some of the other types that are similar to this over it, but it certainly could fit into that as well, that variegated Higashiyama-style variegation. So these plants that we're going to get into our top 20 are the ones that really bring the most white to the landscape consistently. So these are plants that when you go out there, especially in that spring garden, they're really going to catch the eye. I mean, we always talk about how the yellow catches the eye. These are going to be plants that distinctly stand out in the landscape. They bring it against that evergreen background, that bright red that Japanese maples are so famous for. They distinctly stand out against that and make just such contrast in that garden.
So coming at number 20 is one of my favorite Japanese maples. This is Acer palmatum Higashiyama. Now, Higashiyama sometimes is misspelled or has a alternate spelling of Hikasiyama. Whenever we talk about Japanese romanji names that we see, it's often how someone in Japan pronounces it, and then someone tries to write that down in English. And because of that, there are often multiple spellings because there's even, different dialects in Japan. Someone in one region may be saying Hikasiyama where the other one is saying Higashiyama. But Higashiyama means Japanese umbrella mountain. And it's a classic Japanese maple selection. It leaves out with some pink. It unfurls sort of like popcorn. And as soon as that pink is gone, it goes to a really nice white reticulated variegation.
Now, this will be true of many on our list. Generally, the more white or the more pink you have in a Japanese maple, the more late day shade it needs. Higashiyama can handle a good bit of sun, but you will green it up more quickly in full sun. So if you have this one in a high heat condition, it will be less white. If you can provide this one a high canopy, even a high oak canopy, which would be ideal, you can get some really bright shades of white. You can get some almost pale leaves going on, especially in that secondary part of the season right past the spring flush. You get some incredible colors. But if you are in a high sun setting, it will wash that out a little bit more quickly. So growing this one at a more moderate pace and not putting it in too much sunlight will give you the best colors. That's typically going to be true of everything we're talking about today that's bright white. Generally, trees that have a ton of white in them do require more shade, obviously.
Now, Higashiyama is one that is, like Matt's talking about, it is a little more heat tolerant than some of the other super white selections. One thing I want to note about Higashiyama is it is a variegated plant, but this tree does not revert. And reversion is simply putting on green foliage that will not come back to the variegation. Summer flushes of Higashiyama may be solid green, but those actually mature out the next year and show the same variegation as the spring flush did, on your older plant. Now, if you over-fertilize Higashiyama and you put tons of nitrogen on it and you leaf it out very, very quickly, you will get a more solid green plant when it's leafing out. And that's one thing you want to avoid with many of these white Japanese maples is over-fertilizing. Because if you love the white part of the leaf, remember we talked about white is sort of the absence of chlorophyll, and you encourage a lot of chlorophyll in there, you're going to be getting a more green plant. But don't worry if you do make Higashiyama green, wait till the following year, let it leaf out very slowly, and it's going to have that good white, pink and white variegation again the following spring.
All right, coming in here at number 19, we've got Acer palmatum common Nishiki. Now, this one's anything but common, spelled Komon, but it is an amazing plant. This one is one of our first ones with that kind of sand dusting style variegation on it. Now this has a white flaking over all the foliage, which really gives it a interesting, unique look amongst maples. You can get this one, again, late day shade's going to give you a premier color on this one, but if you can leave this one out slowly, you can really get some bright white coloration going on.
Yeah, there will be a little bit of pink to it, but this one can actually get so much white on the foliage that you often wonder, is it a green Japanese maple with white variegation or a white Japanese maple with green variegation? That sand dusting is really unique and really special and makes this tree stand out from many of the other styles, like the Rijino Nishiki styles on Japanese maples that have more of that swirling.
Do a whole list on green variegated plants.
But this is an awesome plant. I mean, it's a classic Japanese maple that's not often seen in the nursery trade. We've got a large one in the ground that was given to us by Richard Bomar at Maplewood Gardens. And it is a plant that is very unique and is very different because that sand dusting really grabs your attention. Now, when you have an older specimen, it is very similar to like a Rijino Nishiki, where you may start to get more green foliage. If you prune those styles of Japanese maples during the winter months and like late winter, early spring, you can promote variegation on that plant and even get some nice swirling in the bark. So even if this one is another one that doesn't revert, but you can actually promote more variegation by giving it a light pruning.
All right, y'all, coming in here at number 18, we've got Acer palmatum Grandma Ghost. Now, this is our first Ghost series on the list. Grandma Ghost, classic for having that smooth green, reticulated veining in it with that white coloration. Really fun, larger overall leaves that are kind of frilly and heavily divided. Makes this one a really unique palette for that bright white coloration. Now, giving this one some late day shade can really encourage those white shades. Again, as true with all these leafing it out slowly, you can get some really nice pale shades going on.
They've got grandma, baby, sister, purple. I mean, they've got a lot of family ghosts with grandma, sister, baby, uncle. Grandma
Where's
is
brother ghost? It's time to have a brother ghost.
Hey now, I'm your brother. We don't need any brother ghosts. But this one is one of the widest of the selections. I'd say sister ghost is probably an honorable mention for me because it can get some really nice shades of white in there.
I like second cousin, third removed ghost my best. That's my favorite.
Grandma Ghost does give you a really nice white color in the spring, later go into a cream, but the new growth flushes on Grandma Ghost can almost be pure white during the summer with the green veining. And when we say something has a reticulated style variegation, that means that the foliage itself is one color, and the veining of the foliage, the veins of that foliage is a different color. And that's what we call a ghost-like variegation because of the Ghost series by Talon Buchholz. And Grandma Ghost is, for me, one of the widest of the Ghost series.
It's pretty spooky in the garden. It makes a really cool habit to it. Grandma Ghost, probably one of the larger leaves of the Ghost series as well, so it really has something unique going on there.
It does, and it has some really nice serrations on the foliage, deeply cut. It's one of those plants like Matt talked about, give it some protection from the hot afternoon sun to really peak up the white variegation and keep that reticulated variegation very prominent and showy throughout the season. If you put this tree in a little more sun, you can encourage a little more chlorophyll and get a lot more green into this plant, mid-spring and early in the summer, where you can hold it a little bit longer if you give it some shade. Coming in at number 17, we've got Acer rufinerve albolumbatum, sometimes referred to as Hatsuyuki.
Yeah, I think Hatsuyuki is probably the original name on this. Again, many Japanese maples will come from Japan, and they'll get into Europe, and then they'll come back with a Latin name. So we'll see trees that we find to be synonymous. And we found albolumbatum and Hatsuyuki to be synonymous. Beautiful snakebark maple that really brings it for that white variegation. We have a massive specimen of this in Hillstone Arboretum. And this one, it used to be in a lot of shade. My Uncle Glenn cut down a bunch of trees, so now it's in a good bit of sun. Still has remarkable variegation. Not only as almost a border variegation, but sometimes some of that striations will get into the middle of the leaf. And it kind of has a lime green with bright white going on. Now, new growth on this one can be exceptionally white.
Now, this is a plant that can be done by rooted cutting. Snakebark maples are often grown by rooted cutting. You can graft them to other snakebark maples as well. One unique thing that we've often learned is that you can graft a snakebark maple to an Acer truncatum, which is crazy because they're not even closely related. Snakebarks are in section Micrantha, where Acer truncatum is in section Platanoidea, so it's closely related to the pictums and the Norway maples. And one thing we know about Japanese maples, and this has been told to us by many different people, is that if you graft a variegated Japanese maple to an Acer oliveranum, you can encourage more variegation because there's a slight stress. And it's crazy because you wonder if grafting some of these variegated snake barks to an Acer truncatum increases a slight stress and gets you even more variegation on some of these variegated snake barks like albolymbatum.
One thing I think it's helped with is heat tolerance in the south for the snake barks. Like that truncatum is one of the most durable root systems, but you are putting a nice motor behind something too. So nothing to be said about having a larger engine pushing that tree up. Definitely truncatum has a bigger root system. I think long term you probably will have more of a vigorous tree on truncatum.
I agree. And the snake barks are known for getting some, they're known for not having the best root systems where they can often wrap around themselves and start trying to choke themselves out, where you can actually graft it onto a truncatum, which is known for having a much better root system. But Acer rufinerve albolymbatum has these really large snake bark leaves, and it's just, they develop a really nice white margin variegation. And it's nice in the springtime, but the summer flush has some of the best margin variegation on any of the snakebark maples. And for being a very white tree, this is one I like to put in the shade. Most snakebarks give them good drainage. Here in western North Carolina, we have a native snakebark, Acer pennsylvanicum, and they grow natively on the mountains, hanging off of rocks, hanging off of the mountainsides. And that's because snakebarks love having good drainage. And Acer rufinerve albolymbatum, no exception. Make sure you've got good drainage. They don't like having wet feet.
All right, y'all, coming in here at number 16, we've got First Ghost. Now, First Ghost is a classic Japanese maple. It is the symbol for Buckholz Nursery. It's known around the world as being one of the most incredible Japanese maples you'll ever see. And this one has a purple border with that bright white reticulated center to it, especially in that early spring. That bright purple border, I think, even makes the whites look even brighter. So it really, really adds to the contrast of that leaf. And I've seen First Ghost just really show out, especially in that spring garden. It is one of my favorite maples because you get that reticulated variegation, but you also get that purple border. It really just adds something to it. I mean, it's almost like two different styles. It's like you overlaid a Tatsumagaki on top of a reticulated form.
I think that purple red border too contrasts so well with the white reticulation, like the white leaf with the green reticulation, that it grabs your attention and makes you realize how white First Ghost is. I mean, First Ghost, oddly enough, wasn't the first Ghost. Purple Ghost was the first selection of the Ghost series, but then it became a Ghost series once they named First Ghost. First Ghost was the first named selection of the Ghost series.
It was a sport over a Japanese maple in Dr. Bump's garden, and Talon Buckholz walked up to the tree, and that sport looked like a ghost hovering above the tree. Now, it's an interesting selection that by grafting that, it continued on those traits, and it had a more ghost-like appearance to it. I love First Ghost. I think it's outstanding. I do think it is very similar, and Talon will talk about this too, that it can be very similar to what's sold in the trade as white peaches.
Yeah, very much so. And very much so, I even asked Talon, I said, could white peaches and First Ghost be the same plant? Because they're both sports that came out of the same garden. And he said, yes, they very much could be. First Ghost is one of those plants that has a unique shape to it. It's not a truly upright tree. It's got a nice semi-pendulous weeping habit, but it still is upright as it grows overall. So it gives a very nice shrub-like form. It can really give you some really nice shades of yellows and oranges in the fall too, which is something we don't often think about with these reticulated Japanese maples. We always focus on a Japanese maple on its primary characteristic, but being a Japanese maple, you typically have good fall color, and First Ghost definitely has some amazing fall color.
All right, y'all, coming in here at number 15, we've got Acer palmatum Snow Kitten. Same tree as Yukiyama or Elmer. I've seen it under many different names. This could
Toriyama Yuki.
Yeah, this could also be the list of trees with too many names. That's what we're at on this one. But we go with Snow Kitten. I think that was fair enough. That's what Fred Hooks put on it. He got it from Larry Stanley, and I've actually had Larry tell me both stories, so I don't know anymore which is right. But I'm going with what he said last time, which is Snow Kitten. Snow Kitten is a variegated form of Makawi etsubusa. I've had some seasons where the new growth on this is just all white and pink. I mean, almost all white. Now, there is a trick to growing this one. We've let people know it can be a little bit more tricky. You don't want to over-fertilize it because then you're not getting good variegation. And if you don't fertilize it, it doesn't grow a lot. So that is kind of the catch to this one.
So according to Larry Stanley, he had some Makawa Yatsubusa bonsais from New Zealand that he was growing in one of his greenhouses, and snow collapsed this greenhouse. And he went out there and was looking through there, and sticking up through out of the snow was a sport on the Makawa Yatsubusa, which became Snow Kitten. Now, Fred, he had a completely different story. He was known for really, really bringing all this, making it exciting and new. And, for him, it was, I snuck this back from Japan and I hollowed out this piece of soap, and I took cuttings of this plant and had it in, put the soap back together and let it harden off. And I snuck that back from Japan.
The more wine was flowing, the bigger his stories got sometime. Great guy. R.I.P. Fred Hooks. He really introduced a lot of interesting maples into the trade.
Great at marketing the plants.
Yeah, he really, really taught us a lot. I learned a lot from watching him. And it was just interesting. So he kind of helped push Snow Kitten out there. He was the one that originally put that name Snow Kitten on it. And just a fun plant. Now, this one's going to be, one that's going to be more of a container plant for most people. I do have one in the ground that I've had in the ground for about 8 years now. It hasn't grown a ton in the ground. Now, I do encourage pruning on one in the ground. So if you're going to try to attempt this one in the ground, I think actually doing that pruning method where you're cutting it back before it leaves out each year is going to give you the most white new growth, but also the most vigor in the plant, because cutting it back heavy is actually going to promote that root system and increase the tree's growth when you're doing it at the right time of the year.
Yeah, it's so true. But we always want to let people know that this can be a little more finicky plant. It is one that is more expensive because it's difficult to produce. And because of that, it's a plant that I think is really cool, really awesome.
Extreme collector plant.
But it's an extreme collector plant. And that's why it's at number 15 rather than much higher on this list. It does put on a lot of sports of growth that are solid white. And that's why it's really attractive with its Makawa Yatsubusa-like layering. I mean, this is one of the Makawa Yatsubusa family. We did a whole podcast on our top Japanese maples in the Makawa Yatsubusa family. And this one is a really cool one because it's very unique and it's very different.
Even from some of that cutback method, I've had some of the branching get bright white on it as well. Like I've even had some of the new growth on it have a pale appearance to it.
Coming in at number 14, we've got Acer palmatum Hana Sukasa.
Oh, I love anything from Sukasa Maple. That's one of my favorite places. And that's where I go to geek out. There's all kinds of places around the world that are my favorite, for each place. But going to visit Yanada Tanaka in Japan is always a special meeting. The first time we were going to visit him, we got an email and he said, guys, I'm not going to be able to meet with you. And we were already on the plane headed to Japan. We had lots of other plans, but I was heartbroken because this guy's like one of our, heroes for what he's introduced. He's put out so many great plants. He's definitely one of the guys at the forefront right now in Japan for introductions. And we got an email from him and he said, I don't think I'm going to be able to meet with you this trip. We were just like, oh my gosh, that was one of our favorite things to do. Well, we were visiting with Yano-san at World Maple Park, and Yano had 2 translators, and he said, oh no, I'm good friends with Yanada Tanaka. He would love to meet with you, but he wants to have an interpreter there. He thought, what good would it do to meet these interesting guys that I'd love to talk to as well and not have an interpreter? And so we said, well, if you'll reach out to him, if we provide an interpreter, would he be willing to meet with us? And oh my gosh, he was so open to it. In fact, when we met with him, we brought an interpreter. He sat down and probably talked to us for 2 to 3 hours, explaining many of his introductions, how they arrive at their names. And Hana Sukasa, one of his top.
Yeah, it really is. He's introduced everything from Hanamatoi, which you may have in your garden, to Sukasa Silhouette. I mean, that's just a wide range of some amazing plants that he has introduced there. And I would say for maples, he grows things a lot like us. He does a lot of very unique and very different Japanese maples that you don't find at many of the other nurseries. And, a lot of the nurseries, they're very specialized, but he specializes and also has a lot of really cool variegated plants. I mean, he really enjoys the variegation like we do.
I think he's the only dude I ran into in Japan with a beard, so we had a kinship right away. I was like, got your bearded brother.
But Hana Sukasa, when it first leaves out, it can be a baby pink, and then it goes to a white color. And then green chlorophyll starts to come into the leaf where it has margin variegation, and the leaves can twist and curve a little bit, and it really has a very unique variegation style because it is pretty much a lot what people see with butterfly in like a 1 gallon, but it can give you some amazing, just solid baby pinks to white on the entire leaf.
Yeah, super interesting plant. Fun place. Now, Hana means flower. Sukasa is actually his father's name that the whole business is named after. So we had that kinship too that his dad kind of got him into this. And Sukasa Maple is the name of the place. Really cool though. Basically flower Sukasa.
So coming in at number 13, we have Acer palmatum Yamanishki. Now, Yamanishki means snow peak, which is sometimes referred to as just Acer palmatum snow peak, and really that's a translation of the name Yamanishki. This is another selection that was introduced in the nursery trade by the late Fred Hooks, and this selection has that Higashiyama style variegation, but it doesn't give you much pink. It really can give you a lot more of that white color with that green veins, so it has a really unique reticulated style for the variegation.
Yeah, I first saw this one, I think in 2010. I was at a dinner at Ed Shin's house, and Fred, being the hype man he is, I think he said it was the only one, which couldn't have been true at the time, but Fred had an auction, and he was selling this in a 3-gallon, and he said, this is the only one from Japan of this specific tree. And I think I bid up like $400. I mean, I was living in Mom and Dad's basement trying to get this nursery off the ground at that point. I was broke as a joke, and $400 did not come lightly. But when I saw this thing, my eyes bugged out. I was like, I have to have it. I chased it. Somebody bought it that had it and put it into a garden. So either there were more of them out there or that signs got out from that guy to everybody else. But incredible tree and a super fun one. And I think that white splotching over top of it really adds something. It really gets to more of a whole white than Higashiyama. So you do get that mountain peak look to it. You definitely get that frosted overlay to it. Oddly enough, it seems to do that a little bit more in sunlight than in dense, heavy shade. It does tend to be a little greener for me in an all shade condition. I've tried this one in sun as well as a high oak canopy that was dense shade. And it liked the high oak it liked the sunlight a little bit better. The one in more sunlight has better coloration consistently than the one in dark shade.
This is a plant where a 1 gallon may not show as much variegation to as a plant that matures out in the landscape. Once you have an older tree out in the landscape, you will get a better reticulated variegation on a more mature specimen than you will on a young 1 gallon plant. So many of the trees coming from the nursery may show more solid green foliage. Don't worry, just give it time. You're going to get that white reticulated variegation on Yamanishki that you were looking for. This is a plant that, for me, it's the whiter Higashiyama.
Yeah.
I mean, if you put the name White Higashiyama on it, this tree is super, super, super white.
Please don't do that.
No, please
That's a terrible
don't.
name.
But we recently did a cultivar highlight on this at Don Schmidt Nursery where you could see some large specimens on this. And it is one of those plants that hold that reticulation fairly well throughout the summer. I mean, we were shooting that in June, and they were still looking fantastic there at Don Schmidt Nursery in Boring, Oregon.
All right, y'all. Coming in at number 12, we've got Acer palmatum butterfly. What the heck? We're at 12 and butterflies all the way down here. So speaking of the name, white Higashiyama, I believe that white butterfly is the same as butterfly. Butterfly is a classic green on white variegation. You'll get that mint almost midsummer on the green. First leaf's out with some pink going on, which is incredible. Then it fades to one of the whitest Japanese maples you'll ever see. Now, oftentimes, this one can be even wider depending on conditions. I've seen butterfly be all white on some new growth branching. I think those are in conditions that are definitely holding more shade, and you're getting more of that peak whiteness to it. The tree has enough chlorophyll in the green to feed it, so you're getting some just premium white coloration. I don't think that isolating those genes does create a new cultivar in white butterfly, though I am skeptical of that one. I think what you're seeing is optimal butterfly conditions and rather than a new cultivar.
I know that one of our customers had one that was just peaked out in its white color, and she was sending cuttings to Oregon for people to produce.
And she'd ask us to, but we were very skeptical. We said, I think this is just optimal condition butterfly.
Our butterfly in our parents' yard at Maplewood Gardens displays very similar white variegation, and it's in an optimal condition. And it can get some solid branches that are white and entire large white spots across the tree. I think J.D. Vertrees may have spotted this at one point too, because he also introduced a selection at one point called Oregon Butterfly, which eventually just sort of went back to butterfly because it was just a grafted, whiter version of butterfly.
And I think that's where people really have to study these after graft for a while. So if you're grafting something that's not truly having new genetics, it doesn't need a separate name. You're just looking at the optimal form of that. I mean, I could put many of these trees in heavy sun and in heavy shade and have two versions of them. But that doesn't mean from graft you're going to get two versions of it.
You notice whenever you travel around the world, different trees look different in different conditions. Even so around our greenhouses. We walk around our cold frames, which are in 55% white poly, and ones that are closer towards the door of, say, Mikazuki may look very different from a Mikazuki that's back towards deeper and deeper in the shade. And the trees that are very different from on, very thick rootstock versus older rootstock, they may even grow at different rates, and that can cause the foliage to look different. Nutrients can cause a lot of different things from a tree that's been fertilized and a tree that hasn't. And so trees can look very, very different all around the world.
And the amount of phosphorus.
Yeah. And the amount of phosphorus plays a big role in adding variegation and displaying more variegation on many plants. We often find variegation sports on Japanese princess styles, those variegated Makawas types. And, you'll see this after the pink or red variegation, the pink or red leaves, and you see some flecking in there. And people were like, well, maybe I can stabilize it. And maybe at some point you will be able to stabilize it.
I get 3 or 4 people that ask every year. They're like, look at my variegated Japanese princess or Mayday. And I'm like, that's awesome, but until it stabilizes, it always does that.
Yeah,
that's just a conditional trait of it.
So it's some things to consider. If you've got a butterfly in your yard, just because it's extra white doesn't make it white butterfly. I mean, it is a butterfly, and they can be different conditions where you may have a butterfly in your yard that has a green leaf with a white margin around the outside, and that's very typical. Or you may have a lot of foliage that are completely white, and that can be typical as well with butterfly.
All right, let's hop in here at number 11. We've got Acer palmatum skeleton's reach, also a tree with a secondary name of Sweet Lucille. I do kind of like the Sweet Lucille just because B.B. King's guitar, Sweet Lucille, but I think Skeleton's Reach most aptly describes what this one looks like. It is a bright white reticulated Japanese maple in that Ghost series-like vein. It was an introduction by Crispin Silva, and it kind of looks like a hand reaching out at you. So I kind of like that Skeleton's Reach. I think that one's probably the more popular name just because it looks kind of creepy already.
I think Dan Himes had came up with that name, and Crispin said, yeah, I like it. And it really does have that sort of creepy reaching look like a skeleton.
I've definitely seen it get some incredible pale shades of white as well.
And it holds those pale shades of white long throughout the season. I mean, we've had some 1 gallons of this in August, September in our cold frames. It gets very hot in our cold frames. We can get to 100, 110 degrees sometimes in the cold frames because, I mean, it's a big greenhouse essentially, and the sun warms it up. So if it's 90 degrees outside, it's a lot hotter than that inside. And often what that means is that the plants get more chlorophyll into the foliage. And with Skeleton's Reach, it doesn't do that. It holds that reticulation long throughout the season. Super
cool plant, newer one on our list, but definitely caught our eye for being one of the palest whites we've seen. All right, y'all, coming in here at number 10, we got Uzunishki. Now that's another Acer palmatum, Uzunishki.
I remember years ago, Matt and I we still are in, a Taiwanese Japanese maple group. And this doctor had posted photos of Uzunishki, and Matt and I were
I could have screamed.
We were just geeking out over it. And I was like, that is a tree that we have to get into the nursery trade. We've got to find this. And it became our mission to find Uzunishki. We found Uzunishki, got into the nursery trade, and it is such a uniquely variegated Japanese maple.
Yeah, super cool. This one can leaf out with a bit of a pink border with almost a sand dusting eye to it. So you kind of get that sand dusting looking in the middle to it. It does go to one of the more extreme Arita Nishiki style variegations. So you get a ton of pink, a ton of white, some light green going on, but the overall color of the tree is extremely white. Now I also like this one because it tends to be multi-stemmed and very short in its nature. So you tend to be more multi-stemmed, and it gives it just a flower vase-like appearance, especially all that white and pink going on.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it's almost like if you mixed a Sumabini with a Koshi, with a common Nishiki, and mix that with an Arita no Nishiki, because you can get the swirls, the sand dusting, and the border all at the same plant. The thing I really like about Uzunishki is where a lot of the Arita no Nishiki style variegated Japanese maples, you get a lot of variegation on the new growth. With Uzunishki, you often have variegation on the older growth as well. And so it really gives you something nice once you have a large Uzunishki. Give it some protection from the hot afternoon sun so you can get this tree to really thrive out there in the landscape. But this is a tree that is a pretty rock solid introduction that is very different and stands out from all the other pink swirls because, I mean, you're getting the sand dusting, you're getting the swirls, and you're getting a border on top of that in the spring. After the border leaves in the spring, you still have a lot of white all across this tree.
Yeah, I can easily put Radiant in here as kind of a one-off for this one. They are probably the two most similar. Radiant tends to have more green in that secondary color of the summer, where I would say Uzanishki tends to be a little bit more white. Both are standouts for white, pink, and green for sure. Main difference is being Uzanishki's much shorter and a little bit more sand dusting looking.
So, guys, coming in at number 9, we have Acer palmatum Murokumo. And this is a selection you don't find too often in the nursery trade. We just listed it for the first time on Mr. Maple pretty recently. The name itself means gathering of clouds. And that's because in the springtime, this one can really give you some really nice white color with this unique variegation that it's hard to describe because you almost think that it's variegated like a ghost-like maple, but at the same time, it's variegated more like a Shinda Sojo, but it's white. And you see some veins in the foliage, but it's not necessarily reticulated. It's such a unique Japanese maple. It's one of those cloud maples that is very different. I first saw this plant when I went to go visit Frank Biles in Olympia, Washington. And he donated a lot of his collection to the Puget Sound Botanical Garden. And we were walking around to the gardens that he'd donated. And I saw this Murokumo out there, and I walked up to it, and I was just enthralled by the variegation. And we're looking at this plant in October, and it was still showing fantastic variegation in October in Olympia, Washington. And I mean, Frank Biles has taught us so much throughout the years. He actually won a Peter Gregory Award just recently when we were able to present it to him at the Maple Society. And
one of our greatest honors ever was presenting that to one of our top mentors, Frank Biles. I know I was nominated for the award, and I said if Frank Biles doesn't have it, it doesn't mean anything to me. It's a true mentor to us, the guy that invited us to join the Maple Society, and another guy who's really kind of paved the way for us to learn a lot in the nursery industry.
He really did. I mean, we were out at a garden show because before COVID, we did a lot of garden shows, and we would travel all around the southern United States. We'd be in Nashville, we'd be in Columbia, South Carolina at garden shows, and we'd load up a trailer full of Japanese maples and take them to these farmers markets and at their different events. And one person said, you need to contact Franklin Boyles. And we were like, who's this? So the more research we did, we realized it was Frank Biles, found a phone number. He invited us to join the Maple Society. I mean, Matt and I are now past presidents, both from the Maple Society. And we learned so much from Frank Biles teaching us, and we're just trying to be sponges and soaking up everything. But when I went to go see that Murokumo, it just grabbed my attention. That was one of those plants on that trip whenever I went to go visit Frank and see his collections of Japanese maples. And Frank, I mean, he had over 800 Japanese maple selections at the time, and that tree just stood out to me.
Yeah, incredible plant. Murokumo, I think he really described it really aptly, that it kind of is like one of those spring colorations. Think of it almost like DeSojo, too. Like, I think this would be a really cool, wider coloration bonsai because it does have a similar style leaf, a little bit more ruffled than DeSojo, but this would make an incredible white spring bonsai. It kind of has that secondary flush that really gets a little bit more washed out on it. Incredible looking. Typically at around 8 to 10 foot, even in a 15-year period, make it a little bit smaller overall. Definitely another tree to give some late-day shade to. I think the slower you leaf this one out, the more protection you're giving it from the hot afternoon sun, the more exuberant, the more outstanding that white coloration is going to be on it.
Coming in at number 8, Acer pictum Usugumo.
Oh, yeah, I love the batwing maple. Y'all know we talk about this one a lot. Usugumo has that large batwing style leaf that's just indicative of Acer pictum. Really cool, but this one has that added benefit of having that swirling, weird whiteness going on inside there. Now, again, leafing this one out when slow and giving it some protection, you can actually get some crazy pink-white colorations going on in the early spring on this one, fading to a light white. And then midsummer, getting a little bit more green going on in there. And that actually helps a lot of these bright white plants. That's something we didn't mention with Murokumo too, but it does fade to a green. And so it gives these plants the chlorophyll they need.
It really does. I remember, again, it's funny where my mind goes because I often think about the first times with a lot of these plants. It's like, when did that plant just blow my mind for the first time? When did I see this plant? And I remember going to N.J. Acer's garden, Ed Shin, and seeing his big Acer pictum Usugumo. and it just grabbed my attention. And he told me that, he had this really large Acer Pictomusugumo. And at the time, we didn't. And I looked around and I was like, man, that tree is so amazing. And he had this friend, Pat Marone, who was a gardener for Fraser. And many of y'all may have seen Fraser and many different of his TV shows. But this guy was his gardener, and he had an Acer Pictomusugumo that was even bigger than Ed's. And I was like, what in the world? I mean, we later bought Brian Upchurch's nursery, and along came with the stock plants of Acer Pictomusugumo, which is now one of the plants planted at Maplewood Gardens.
It's getting pretty big now.
It's getting pretty big. I mean, it's probably 15 to
15 feet.
15 to 18 feet. I mean, it's got some good size to it now. It's got a lot of white color. When it first leaves out, it gives you some nice coral colors to it. And it just has a unique style of variegation. I mean, it is very different. It's swirling, almost reticulated, but the bat wing shape of the leaf gives a huge platform to show that white color. And this tree can do well in some shade, but for us in Western North Carolina, it can also handle the sun.
All right, y'all, coming in here at number 7, we got Peve Multicolor. This is a funky one, too. Now, this one's definitely a sand dusting variegation style, and it's really weird. Now, leaving this one out slow can give you your most interesting multicolor habit.
Yeah, it really can. I mean, this is one of those plants that it doesn't variegate well every single year. And some years
it's Peve one color.
Some years it's Peve one color. And if it's Peve one color, guess what? You got a green Japanese maple that has a good fall color. So you don't miss out even in the off years. But when this tree puts on its variegation, it is a unique introduction by Piet Vergelt in Holland, the same guy who introduced Peve Starfish, American, and so many other great plants.
It almost gives you like a reticulated vibe to it. Like it is more of that Ukigumo sand dusting style variegation, but you almost get more of like a Ghost Series type vibe with it in early spring. Like you can get some pink in there, some white, and that sand dusting is so strong that it kind of looks more reticulated, even though it isn't. Like it really gets like that larger leaf to it and a weird style. I saw this one at Augustin Coelho's place in Toulouse. I went and visited him after one of the Maple Society meetings in Belgium, and I just fell in love with this tree. As Tim mentioned, this one's one from Piet Vergelt, and you will see Peve at the beginning of many of his introductions. It's kind of his signature there on some of his plants, Piet Vergelt, and he's hyphenated both of his names into being Peve, basically, is his little signature there going on. You'll see it on Peve Starfish and many other plants. And typically, I did have Tyne Vergelt visiting us at our nursery. It is said Peve, not PV.
It is. And this is one that you want to avoid giving lots of fertilizer, because if you give it tons of fertilizer, you will often encourage more green foliage versus having that variegated foliage that this one's really known for. But it gives you some nice yellows to oranges in the fall, whether it variegates or not. But when this thing does variegate, it is multicolors. I mean, it really does have some pinks in there and then the whites with the green veining. And it is such a unique plant. The foliage is a little more divided back. So if you're thinking of foliage, if you're familiar with Tiger Rose, it has a very similar leaf shape, leaf morphology as Tiger Rose. But this plant is so unique and so different that when it does variegate, that's the reason why it falls so high on our list, because it is really special. Now, you may notice often on our website, we will call it Peve Multicolor, and we'll spell it Multicour.
Color.
And that's because that's actually how they spell multicolor often in Europe. And this selection did come from Europe. And oddly enough, that's how the correct spelling is. But often you may find it spelled with multicolor without the U.
All right, y'all. We're almost into our top 5. We're at the number 6 spot. You're going to be shocked by this one. It's the Floating Clouds Maple, Acer palmatum, Ukigumo, not even in the top 5. Wow, okay. So this one is incredible for that white variegation. Again, a little inconsistent. We always let people know with Ukigumo, not every single season will this one be bright white, but when it is, it's going to blow your socks off. I have a whole video on our YouTube channel too. You should go watch. I'm in a high oak canopy at one of our rental houses for my parents, and I have a Ukigumo in that garden, and it leaves it out very slowly. And that's really one of the main tricks for this one, is leafing Ukigumo out slowly. It can be definitely greener in some of the highest heat conditions. If you're leafing this one out slowly and not in full sun, you'll get way better colors on it.
Now, you said that one will really knock your socks off. That used to be my catchphrase. And There was this guy who called, and he had a nudist colony in South Carolina, and he was talking about some different Japanese maples to plant at his nudist colony. And I said, man, this one's got great color. It's going to really knock your socks off. And I said, well, I guess you already got your socks off.
We will not be doing a walkthrough of that garden.
But Ukigumo is one of those plants that gives you some amazing, amazing white color. And make sure that you don't over-fertilize. Make sure you give it some protection from the hot afternoon sun. Lead this tree out as slowly as you can, because when this tree does put the white out there, it is super white. And there's years it can be whiter than others, and some years it can be totally green, and then again, you've got a tree that can give you some really nice yellows and oranges in the fall.
I've had it be brilliant orange. I've had it rival Osakazuki for orange. I always want to let people know, even in seasons where it's not that white, I've had oranges on this that were some of the best oranges I've seen.
Yeah, it really has a great fall color. So if you plant it for a fall color maple, and then when it gives you the white color, you're going to be really shocked, and really it's going to grab everybody's attention, because it does look like floating clouds.
Low nitrogen's key there. You don't want to be doing anything to encourage faster leaf out times. So not fertilizing this one, planting it in areas where it's going to get more shade so that the buds aren't opening up more quickly in the early spring, and giving it as slow and consistent of a spring as you can possibly provide. Now, some of that's out of your hands, obviously. I mean, you can't change nature. Nature's going to be what it is. But if you can give this in a slower leaf out time, that's how you get those peak colors.
Yeah, that's for sure. Coming in at number 5, y'all, we're already in the top 5. We've got Acer palmatum alarian. And this is the whitest tree on our list from Talon Buckholz.
Yeah, it's in that Aridino Nishiki style variegation. Like, I would definitely compare it to that as maybe the widest of any of those forms. Really cool, and it actually has some of those high, intense white shades. It's got a little pink going on and a little green, but if you get this one in the right conditions, that primary color to the entire plant is white, and it's just consistent. I love it. I definitely recommend giving it more shade. That'll pick up that white secondary growth. Often when this one first leaves out, you'll have an equal amount of white and pink going on. But then as that summer gets just even barely started, the whole plant will morph more of a white with light green.
To me, it's the widest selection of any of those Aridino styles, and it will put on so much variegation that I often wonder how the tree survives, because it is all white. When we first got this tree from Talon Buckholz, he was very concerned about it coming to the southern United States.
Right.
And he was like, guys, make sure you give this plenty of shade. We're like, what are you talking about? And we opened the box, and this tree is almost purely white. And we're like, what in the world is this? I've never seen anything so white in my life. And it became one of those trees that were like, this is a tree that we need to be offering. It's really unique, very different, but it really just puts on tons and tons and tons of white variegation.
Now, it's done great here in the South. It does need some protection from the hot afternoon sun for its best colorations, but durability has really been really good on this one.
Now, Alarion was actually the name of one of his workers. And what Talon will often do is he'll have lots of seedlings he grows out there of just tons of seedling Japanese maples. And he will tell his employees, hey, pick out the one that speaks to you, and it may become a named variety. And Alarion was one that Alarion had found and said, I really like this tree. And sure enough, I'm glad he found it, because this tree is just electric with that white variegation.
All right, y'all, coming in here at number 4, we've got Acer campestre carnival. Now, this one is incredibly consistent on the white. In fact, it's one of my favorite white plants to really just put that weird color going on in the landscape. This one, surprisingly, can handle a good bit of sun, up to zone 8, being a totally white with a little bit of green in it, Japanese maple. Or essentially, it's a European field maple, but in that Japanese maple kind of category of plants.
I think the biggest mistake people make with Acer campestre carnival is it has a lot of white variegation with typically like a little small green splotch in the center of the leaf. And people will take this tree and say, this is so white, I need to give it shade. I mean, the same thing that, Talon was worried about with Alarion for coming to the southern United States. People see carnival and they say, that is so white, I need to give it shade. But we're talking about an Acer campestre, a European field maple. This is a plant that doesn't do well in the shade. It seeks out the sun. And so you have to find that balance of giving it enough sun, but not giving it too much sun if you're in a zone, 9 or an 8B. You've got to make sure that you give it some slight shade, but enough sun that this tree is going to do well.
I was quite impressed with this. I actually did an experiment on this when I first got it. It was probably like 12, 13 years ago. I stuck one in a heavy, dense shade canopy, and that one kind of had diminishing returns, to be honest with you. It really didn't take off. the ones in sun really outperformed the ones in dense, heavy shade. Blew me away. You get some crazy pinks on where the all white part is, and the green can get to a bold red in the fall. It's a multi-stem tree that wants to be more of a rounded canopy to it. Beautiful overall approach, and I mean, what's not to love about this one? We've been offering some Big Tens in this. I think everybody's been snatching those up as quick as possible. It is an incredible coloration that really blends a lot of the garden. I mean, when you get out there, these white plants are going to be your focal point planting, especially in that spring garden, because they're going to draw the eye right to the most bright part. And it's going to brighten up darker places in the garden, but it's also going to make all those other colors in your landscape even bolder.
So coming in at number 3, we've got a trident maple, Acer burgerianum, Waco nishiki. Now, also on this list could have been Hanatura sato. They're very similar with their white reticulated variegation. And this is a trident maple that when they leaf out in the early spring can be completely white. And then you start to see some chlorophyll starting to come into the foliage. And this is a plant that many people think, how's the tree survive because it is so white? And the great thing about this tree is it does green up during the summer so that it can survive those hotter times during the season, but then gives you some good fall color. Now, Waco nishiki, this is a good trident maple. I mean, trident maples are very heat tolerant. They are a unique plant that as it matures, you start to get some really unique bark interest on the trident maples as well. Acer burgerianums are very popular for bonsai. There's so many different things that you can do with trident maples. They're often even used as street trees. But this gives you a white tree that is extremely durable and easy to grow. And the white color on this in the spring is just amazing.
Yeah, it's actually a real benefit that it does go to a green later in the season. It allows this one to, not have an understock that actually feeds it. Now, Hanatura sato and Waco nishiki are similar in that spring garden, but they do have some diverse differences. I find that Waco nishiki tends to be a much faster grower, and it tends to make more of a robust tree, where Hanatura sato in general tends to be a little bit more multi-stemmed overall. I've had incredible fall colors on both of these. Typically, Hanatura sato tends to have a little bit more pink to it, and then get a little bit more red. Waco nishiki tends to be almost even more white sometimes for me. I get a little bit less of the blend of pink in it and more of a pale white to it. But incredible plants overall, either which one you pick. The Waco nishiki can really give you some of the most pale white shades. And I've had that one in dark shade, really surprising people. Now, I have seen this tree in Tom Cox's garden as well, Waco nishiki, really performing well. And that's right outside of Atlanta in the Zone 8.
Yeah. Coming in at number 2, we're down to number 2, Acer platanoides, Walder Sai. Now, this is a very unique Japanese maple. And it's not even a Japanese maple, but it's so white and it's ornamental. We're going to include it in the list of maples that are super, super white. This tree has large Norway maple leaves. I mean, huge. And in the springtime, they're just almost pure white. It is amazing.
Yeah, this one kind of gives you a little bit of reticulation. It kind of gives you a little bit of what you think of as sand dusting. It'd be a very hard one to describe how it's truly variegated. Now, it does have reticulated veining in it for sure, so it definitely has more of that going on. It's a, this is basically a variegated Norway maple with that large Norway maple leaf that has a huge platform for all that white variegation on as well. Now, typically, this one does slow down a little bit being a variegated plant, typically around 15 feet, even in 10 years. Real showstopper, though, for the landscape, and one that's going to work zones 3 through 7, where most of the ones we've talked about today are more zones 5 through 9. This one's a little more 3 through 7.
I know we were visiting the gardens with Talon Buchholz of his private home in Oregon, and he had a large Acer platanoides Walder Sai out there, and it shocked us because it's not something that you see that often, but Talon really liked the plant and had one planted there in his gardens.
Surprisingly handle a lot of sun.
It can handle a lot of sun there for him. And it is a plant that it's not something that you're going to find at every nursery. And when you find it, you're not going to find it in high quantities. But if you do find it, you're going to want to get it because this plant is really special.
Definitely one we'll be offering again here on Mr. Maple. So as we get in here to our number 1, you can guess in the comment section below. If you're listening to us on a podcast platform, hey, head on over to Mr. Maple Friends. That's our page on Facebook. It's actually our group. And our group there is a great way to interact with us. And we'd love to know what your favorite all-white Japanese maple or all-white maple is. We've got a lot of plants on this thing, not just Japanese maples.
So we've got a couple honorable mentions, and these may be honorable mentions that didn't make the list or ones that we forgot until we got to number 1. So my honorable mention for here is Acer leucodermae Confederate Ghost.
Yeah. I mean, it can almost get like some silvery veins to it with green. We've talked about that one in another podcast. Being a native chalk maple, it's super funky. It almost gets blue. I mean, it's a weird color. It's like a blue-green-white. Blue-green-gray? I don't know what you call that.
It's a sugar maple that can handle a lot of heat in the south, but at the same time, it's reticulated with white, and you see the veins of the foliage.
Now, I've had my best success with this one in a lot of shade. Like, I've had it grow much faster in heavy shade. I haven't tried it in full sun, to be honest with you, but it seems to like that shaded condition a good bit.
A selection by Ted Stevens, our friend at Nurseries Carolina. This was found as a chance seedling he found from one of the most southern growing regions of Acer leucodermae. His idea was, I want to go through and collect a lot of Acer leucodermae seed in one of the southernmost regions so that we've got one of the most heat tolerant selections of these Acer leucodermae, so it can grow in a lot of spots to the south. And oddly enough, when he did this, he found this one that was almost pure white. And
it is one we'll be offering here on Mr. Maple. It's a little tricky getting sugars grafted these days. We got to get the callus pipe out to get them grafted, so we're a little slower at producing sugars, but this is when we're working to get back up in numbers.
Now, while we're going on these honorable mentions, I'm going to mention Acer scutia el chupacabre. This is one that doesn't exist anymore, and that's the reason it's in the honorable mentions.
Even the photos of El Chupacabre are blurry. Did it ever really exist?
Unfortunately, this is one that was a chance seedling of Acer scutia that we'd collected at Stephen F. Austin University, and it was pure white. And we were like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. And then it disappeared. So
we can't even find it.
As El Chupacabre, and now it's just left to rumors and stories.
Another honorable mention, Acer palmatum kagero. Now, kagero is an interesting one that has white to yellow swirling variegation in that big leaf. We actually have some variegated forms of it here, but it's incredibly rare to see this large amoenum style with a swirling style variegation. I would compare it to a lot like Fujinami Nishiki, where it is very hard to keep it fully variegated, and the tree must be pruned for color rather than shape. So you have to take out any of the all green branching in the tree, or it will completely revert on you. But when it has its peak white variegation, it really has something special. And with that kagero too, they do leaf out, more yellow on green and then fade to that more white coloration. So the more white will kind of be more of a midsummer look to it. It does require some shade, and I think that's a little bit of why that yellow color pales out.
Coming in another honorable mention, we have Acer palmatum Shirayuki no Mei.
Yeah, tricky one to say, interesting one to grow. I actually planted one of these in a high oak canopy last year. I was skeptical of this plant and its durability because the bark is even white. It's a very rare one from Japan. It's one we have here. I haven't seen really anywhere else. I have gotten some grafts going on it. It will be light green and bold white. It's kind of in that Aridino style in a way, but it's all pale white. It's so white the bark even gets a pale white. Interestingly enough, you have to graft it right away when you cut the scion, kind of like Bihu, because the scions do dry out fast when you cut the wood, so it has to be grafted immediately once it's cut. The bark itself is so pale. I mean, it looks like old white bark on a very mature tree. Super interesting color, though. No pink in it, all white.
And that's another selection by Yataka Tanaka at Tsukasa Maple. It is outstanding. I mean, when we went and visited him, he literally took us to a whiteboard and drew out the symbols of many of his introductions and explained what many of the names meant. And that's when we found out that Kinpai was basically meaning variegated form of Osakazuki. And when he did this, he also wrote the name of this tree and said, Acer palmatum Shirayuki no Mei, and it means basically like white dancer, like a white ballerina. And it was really interesting to sort of hear all of these stories and what these different names on these plants mean. But Shirayuki no Mei, I mean, super, super white.
I think if it was more common, it could even be number one. I mean, that one's up there.
It definitely is. It's one that, we may be one of the few people in the United States with this plant, and not in large numbers at all. Right
I only knew of one other place that ever had it, and they lost it. So I think we were the last ones with it. Maybe the first ones with it, but the last ones with it for sure. And mine in the ground's done surprisingly well. Like, I've left it in the ground now for 3 years. It's went through probably -5, no problem for us here in Western North Carolina. So I think I'm going to give it a chance and try to get it out there a little bit more. All right, y'all, coming in at number 1. Can you guess it? We've got Acer Pictum Naguri Nishiki.
Y'all, this is the Batwing Maple. And many of y'all first saw this plant when we did our cultivar highlight of Usugumo. And we made the mistake of doing our cultivar highlight of Usugumo in front of Acer Pictum Naguri Nishiki in the background.
Right.
And
Comment section blowing up.
The comment section was, okay, if that is Usugumo that you're talking about, what is that tree in the background? Because it is so much wider than Usugumo. And Usugumo is very, very white. And Naguri Nishiki, it was that tree. I mean, it's this large batwing maple that is very unique and different because it is super white. It is the whitest maple of them all.
You get some splotching of green in the leaf. This one, every single season, I've grown this plant. I'm in Zone 6B here in western North Carolina. We're very close to Hendersonville, if you know our area. Every single season this tree's leafed out for me, it's been all white. Like, it has never had a season where it leafed out green at all. And the colors have been impeccable. I mean, the leaf shape, the color, the contrast. I've got so many of these out in the ground. I just keep planting them. I can't stop. I'm like a maniac with this one. I have to keep putting it in the garden. Every time I put a new garden out or have a new area, I'm like, what would look good back here? Naguri Nishiki. So I stick another one in the ground because it looks so interesting next to all the other maples. And it makes such a backdrop for all these greens and yellows and reds.
Now, one of our good friends, Mark Wethington, we've known him for years when he was the assistant director of the Arboretum, and now he is the director of the Arboretum at North Carolina State University, which is known as the J.C. Rouston Arboretum. And he went to Japan, and we got an email the second he came back, and he said, guys, I saw this amazing pictum over there. Do you have it? I want it. And I'm like, yeah, Mark, we've got it. That's Naguri Nishiki. It's one of those plants that grabs people's attention because it truly is so white. And it is something that is so unique because that white color can be handle the sun, it can handle the shade, and it is one of those plants that you can put in those dark spots in the garden, and you're truly going to have something that really, really brightens up that area.
Yeah, so let us know. This is our top 20 with some honorable mentions of the most white maples. Let us know if there's something we missed, and if there's something you would love to see included on this list, drop that comment section. We love to see what you guys think about some of these lists we put together. We figured this was a fun format to kind of go over some different styles and some of the most pale Japanese maples. Tim loves the pale.
I am one of those people that needs some protection from the hot afternoon sun because I do have very Irish genetics. I get a lot of sunburn to my foliage, to my to my skin, and these white Japanese maples are those plants that are simply amazing, and they can give you some of that great white color.
Oh, it's incredible. I'm a huge fan of these. And like I said, they really stand out against everything else there in the landscape. We hope you enjoyed this whole breakdown. So if you enjoy this, make sure to support our sponsor, which surprisingly enough is us also. So shop at MrMaple.com. That's what makes all these free podcasts and free videos we put out possible. And you guys have been so incredible in growing our podcast, especially on those audio platforms. They've really been blowing up there, but also on our YouTube format. If you're on one and you're not on the other, definitely go check out the other. We put out 7 days a week content on our YouTube channel. There's always something new and interesting coming to MrMaple.com, whether it's through our 10 at 10s or just random sales and releases we're doing. There's always something interesting. We love to keep it lighthearted and fun, and we appreciate you gardeners being part of it.
Take care.
God bless.
Have a great day.